you. Good morning. Welcome to Infosecurity Europe, the last day. It's my great pleasure to induct someone who needs no introduction, but I'm going to let him do that himself. Self-styled security curmudgeon, and you're too nice a guy for that, I might say. There's some illustrious company that the gentleman next to me is in, including Eric Cole, Fred Piper, Bruce Schneier, Dan Kaminsky, Eugene Kaspersky. And now, I'd like to introduce Jack Daniel, Tenable Network Security. We're going to spend the next 25-30 minutes going through Jack's career and what journey's taken him to be here today. We're going to look at the state of the security industry as it is and what's out there in the future. And then at the end of this, we'll throw the questions from the floor. So, just looking at Jack's early career, an accidental introduction into security. How does a college dropout get to be strategist at Tenable?
I'm still not sure. A lot of people ask me for career advice, and I make it up because the path of random sequences, many mistakes, and then some great good luck and the support of friends and family is a great path. It's worked extremely well for me, but it's hard to repeat. I was a mechanic. That was my background. I was an auto mechanic. I was one of the few true Renault experts in the United States, and it's possible that masochism that comes with being a Renault mechanic pre-qualified me for being in information security. It certainly taught me how to diagnose serious problems. That's common. But the short version of that path is I was an auto mechanic on odd vehicles, Jeep and Renault, and a lot of times the problems I found were things that I couldn't explain to the parts department well. So I had to find my own parts. And then one day, there was nobody in the parts department, and I just went in and got my own parts, and they said, well, can you help out until we get a new guy in parts? And they never found anybody competent, and the next thing I know, I was running parts operations for a chain of dealer groups, multiple franchises across multiple towns, and that meant I was using the computer. And one day they handed me this tape thing to put in a trash compactor-sized refrigerator. We had a pile of them in a room. And this is how the spark plugs and oil filters prices get updated. Like, cool. Throw that in. A couple of weeks later, they hand me a box this big, packed with tapes, and a small town phone book sized manual, and said, well, you do those other tapes, do this. And at that point in time, I did not know what an operating system really was. I did not know what backups meant and how important they were until later in that weekend.
Did anyone mention security?
Oh, no, we weren't worried about security at all at that point in time. But that was my introduction to administering computer systems for a small, mid-sized business. And as you administer computer systems, sooner or later, most likely sooner, although this was decades ago, we got away with more then. Sooner or later, bad things happen, right? And so you learn how to fix that. And then bad things happen from the outside because bad people do things to you, often because of your own misconfiguration in the NT days. And then you learn how to fix bad things and then make it harder for the bad guys to do them to you again. And that's the abbreviated version of how I ended up in security, is learning by that. And from there, it was just learning everything I could, because I really liked the challenge of solving the security problem without impacting usability.
And what made you get into the security industry per se? What was that took you away from being a user to be a developer and having that knowledge from the inside?
It was very gradual. I mean, I spent years doing automotive management in the parts and service operations. I continued doing the diagnostic systems in early computerized automobiles. And so I was doing more and more computer as a user, but also as an administrator in the dealer group and for a variety of other small businesses in the region that I worked in. And it just became more and more until it was all I was doing was administering systems. Then I focused more and more on security. It was extremely gradual, and eventually ended up doing network security consulting and helping a lot of folks formally and informally secure their systems. And I decided it was time to join vendor land, and so about not quite 8 years ago, I crossed into the vendor space, which was one of the very lucky things. I joined a company called Astaro, a German firewall vendor, which was acquired about 4 years ago by Sophos. But while I was at Astaro, I learned a lot about dealing with customers, dealing with supporting people trying to secure their environments. And that was really that step into it as providing services, hardware and software.
How much of what you learned from the car industry transferred over in security? Did you bring a wealth of knowledge which they didn't have in dealing with real people?
I think so. There were a lot of things that I had to unlearn from the car business. We're here at an event which has a trade show floor expo, and people sometimes complain about that sort of feeling, but unless you've been to an automotive dealer convention, this is nothing. So that sort of abuse of customers that unfortunately is rampant. I assume it is here. It seems to be universal in the auto industry. I had to leave that behind, but that was easy for me. That was never. But the understanding of that I learned there. For example, I learned that I couldn't solve the problems if we didn't have money. It was, the companies that I worked for didn't often make a lot of money, and therefore I had choices like, well, do you want to pay your employees this week, or do you want to renew your firewall maintenance? And that's a lesson that a lot of people in the trenches in security haven't actually learned. It's like, if you can't afford it, you can't do it. So we're going to prioritize. We're going to do what we can afford to do. We're going to do the best, and we're going to try to target what's going to make the most impact with what's available to me, and not worry about being perfect. And that is a challenge that a lot of us, that when we get wound up about security, we forget. It's like, no, we can't solve a lot of these problems, but we can make it a little better tomorrow, and we can put ourselves on a path to being enough better that we make it hard for people to attack us, and in the process, hopefully make it more reliable for our users.
Has anything changed, though, in the time? The attitude still persists?
I think that the attitude persists. I think there's a path that a lot of people take, and I think it shows the people that move into more senior or more management roles, not even if you're managing people, but if you move, I hate to say that staying highly technical isn't moving forward, but people that move into more administrative or more management roles or more policy or vision roles, however you want to define that, have to learn the lesson of prioritization to move forward. And one of the things that I have been doing lately at Tenable, which is fantastic, is I have conversations with people in management and director and executive levels, and you can tell the people that have come from a trench position. They were the firewall analysts, they were the network analyst, they were writing code, and they've moved into these positions, and the ones that hang on to the absolutism that you have when you're configuring switches or deploying machines, if you don't temper that, you kind of hit a wall. And the people that are able to communicate well, prioritize, accept the setbacks and maximize the victories, and no matter how small, tend to move forward, I think, and are more effective. And they're also more content in their jobs. There's less frustration.
You mentioned the trenches, and you're on the other side of the fence. And one of the things, looking at what you've been doing, is very strong in building communities.
Right.
How did you get into that? I know, but in particular, the B-sides communities.
So the way, the path to that was through not having resources. So when my job supporting the dealer, the auto franchises, as well as travel agents and lawyers and realtors and others that I supported, I didn't have a training budget to speak of. I was able to get some training. I flipped that around, but even before that, I found the local user community, the local user group. In the Providence area, there was one group in particular that was outstanding. They've changed names a few times, but it's the same core group of guys, and they were, they knew Novell and they knew Windows, and some of them were Linux and Unix guys, and I would go down there once a month and we would share. And at first I was just absorbing information. And there are a variety of groups in the Boston area. In Boston, we have a phenomenally active user community. And there are, during the winter months, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there may be 6 to 10 meetups every night on security, Linux, Drupal, WordPress, they're just whatever you're interested in. So the security and systems admin groups were very welcoming. I went and just absorbed information. It started engaging in conversations, and I showed up one day, and I don't even remember what it was. We had a conversation, and it was, oh, I had that problem, and here's how I solved it. And that ended up being a discussion. And the next month, they said, can you do a presentation on that? So I presented on how I had addressed this problem. I didn't think it was radical, but I was sharing my experience, and there were people in the group that had yet to face this challenge. And from there, I realized how important it was to take advantage of the networks that you have, the community, and actually not leech off the community, but be an active part of it, because that was the only way I was going to learn. And I realized a lot of people were the same way. And from that really progressed into more and more engagement with the local community. I then, some years ago, attended ShmooCon for the first time, which is in Washington, D.C. It's sort of it's a hacker con, but it's all more, federally cleared people. And it saw the greater hacker community at its best, I think, in many ways, and also at its worst. But it's a conference. People sometimes go to the pub and drink a lot at conferences, I've heard. And from there, the DEF CON and the Black Hat community, and more of the community. And what happens with B-Sides particularly is 6 years ago right now, people were receiving, as I did earlier this week, their rejection notice from Black Hat or DEF CON. And that was when Twitter really became a meeting place for a lot of security people. And they were complaining on Twitter. And as eventually happens, somebody said, forget you, I'm going to build my own clubhouse. But we had a conversation, a handful of us had a conversation about why the talks were turned down, and some of them were really good talks. They just really weren't right for the Black Hat DEF CON vibe. Some of them were a little too policy specific, some of them were a little too defense specific. Some were newer speakers that didn't have a track record, so they really couldn't gamble on that many new speakers. And so we made this little event happen. Chris Nickerson and the DEF CON 303 crew rent a house. So we did it at that house, and we just showed up. And we had some great content, and we had a great time. And the thing was that there was this room, and if you didn't want to listen to the talk, you popped into the kitchen, and you grabbed a beer, you went out to the swimming pool, and you continued the conversation. It was really about just continuing conversations. And we were on to something because people asked for more. And as of yesterday's B-Sides London event, in under 6 years, there have been 197 B-Sides events globally, in 84 cities in 19 countries. The only continent we haven't reached is Antarctica. And it continues to grow. It is, a lot of them are in the US, but there are a lot here. There are 2 in the UK.
Please do tell us where the next one is.
The next one is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the northern Midwest of the United States. I'm not sure when the next European one is, but things that are coming up. There are a handful in the US. The folks in Sao Paulo, Brazil, do them 3 or 4 times a year. There's one coming up pretty soon in Lisbon. The one in Manchester here in the UK is a little later this year. They do them in a couple different places in Germany from time to time. I know that at the end of the year there'll be one in Hamburg. There's a crew in Warsaw that does them regularly. There are folks working on them. And the thing about them is some of them are large. So B-Sides London was nearly 1,000 people yesterday. B-Sides Las Vegas was 1,600 people last year. We expect up to 2,000 this year. On the other end, there have been events in Australia where there were 20 or 22 people. However, those 20 or 22 people got together. Memphis, Tennessee, people got together that otherwise didn't meet. And it's connects people. And it, in the marketing world, you talk about content and conversation and community, but we really mean it. And it's one of the reasons that I actually like coming to trade shows. I don't mind standing in the booth, and because I get to talk to folks. I get to hear what your challenges are. If the salespeople are by me, I'll pretend it's all about selling you something, but it's not. It's having a conversation, understanding the challenges people face, trying to help them, help me understand it, and if it works in the vendor angle, great. If we all get a little more secure, that's even better.
Speaking about conversations that you had, a couple of notable quotes from such meetings you've said in the past. We forget about the fundamentals of security. We're too focused on creating problems and then building security later. How true do you think that still is?
I think it is still fundamentally true that there are a couple of distractions. One is that when new and noteworthy things make the news, we focus on them. And you shouldn't ignore big new threats, right? Something gets named and gets a logo, we have to take it seriously. And reports have shown that once it's reached that level of popularity or notoriety, those vulnerabilities are exploited in the wild. But if you are focused on the next headline vulnerability and you still haven't ferreted out all of the Windows XP in your environment, you may have missed something. If you're really worried about the latest theoretical attacks on cryptography, on cryptanalysis, and you don't have a complete and accurate inventory of the devices in your environment, you're probably could spend those precious resources better to get those fundamentals. I'm not saying that the big problems aren't big, but the stuff we know how to fix is a challenge. And it comes back to, on the attack and defense side, at least let's make it a little bit harder for people to get our stuff. The news reports are just full of people that had easy entry into systems, and I understand it. It's exciting, it's got a logo, and we were waiting for vulnerabilities with theme songs now. I'm waiting for the first vulnerability to get its own television show. But as fun as that will be, it's not going to solve password reuse in your office.
One of the current, here we've seen a lot of a move from prevention response rather than prevention. How true do you think that is?
I think that it has to be balanced. I think the idea of purely focusing on prevention is naive and myopic. However, other people, there's some people who really just are all about discovery and detection and response, and I think that you can go too far that way. They're fundamentals. I've gotten into this argument, having been in the firewall business for several years, and now working with Marcus Ranum, who is one of the co-creators of commercial firewalls. I've gotten into this argument a few times where pen testers and others tell you how easy it is to bypass firewalls, and they like to talk about obsolete technologies. And in obsolete technologies, they say antivirus, or what we now call endpoint protection. They talk about firewalls and IDS and IPS and those sort of fundamental pieces, and they say they don't work, right?
AV is dead.
AV is dead. AV's been dead almost as long as IDS, right? However, I was actually had this argument at DEF CON a few years ago. It's like somebody said we should just throw them all away, and I said, okay, I'm good. Let's throw away all of our firewalls. Let's throw away antivirus. Let's throw away IDS. Let's throw away IPS. Let's throw away all those things. But before we do, I would like them all to be properly deployed just once. Properly configured, properly deployed just once. Let's give that a try. And everybody kind of fell silent. It's like, let's properly segment our networks. Of course, that means we have to understand what's in our networks, and then we have to categorize that so that we have some rough idea of what has different values and different needs and what needs to talk to each other. And then you build your firewall rules and tune your IDS rules, and you create exceptions or not within your antivirus or endpoint protection and your anomaly detection systems, and now everything starts to work better. Is it going to stop everybody? No, it's not. And that's where you really need to be able to detect things. But this goes back to those fundamentals. A lot of beardy old Unix guys have been saying that we need to pay attention to NetFlow. The cranky old network guys have said, we need to pay attention to NetFlow data. And it's more true than ever, and we need to pay attention to that to help us understand, hey, this is different. I don't know what it means, but this is different, and we look at it and see if it's different good, different bad, or just, it was Patch Tuesday, although those are apparently being sunset. Okay, that's why there was different amount of traffic. So I think it needs to be balanced, because you can go either way. And if you forget about protection, you'd better really be good at detection and cleanup, because you're going to be doing more of it.
Before they get their television show, what do you think is going to be the next generation of threats? What's the landscape going to look like?
I think one of the things we're going to continue to see, and I don't know if it will continue to be the fundamentals, but now that people are taking a close look at a lot of very old code, particularly open source libraries, but that's not to pick on open source, but because what's happened, we've seen with some of these, SSH and SSL and now some of the older TLS things, we've seen some issues in other trusted protocols, and the more you dig in some of those old universal libraries, the more I think people are going to find problems. And there's a lot of code that the internet is built on. And even if you step outside of the open source code base in Linux and the BSDs and Unix into the modified versions, or maybe not modified versions that Apple uses, it's certainly true that a lot of Windows, a lot of what's in Windows has been learned from the rest of the industry. If Microsoft were still building their own network stacks without peeking at how BSD builds a network stack, we'd still be using hubs for our Windows stuff. They wouldn't know how to move packets at any speed. And so they copy some of the problems. And so I think that people are starting to, we've seen in the past couple of years, really looking at the fundamental stuff we haven't looked hard at. Because I think the big new bugs, the new classes of bugs, Mark Dowd hasn't changed our perspective on what he can exploit in a couple of years, so it's time to focus on that. And it's probably, we're probably overdue for looking at, decade-plus libraries. And that said, by the time we're done, there will be something that has completely proven me wrong. But, you look at the stuff that we take for granted, and that applies in physical infrastructure, right? Until somebody looks under the bridge with a hammer and goes tap, tap, and the concrete just collapses, you don't realize, that we're in an infrastructure that's pretty broken.
Well, in your career, you've seen a lot of infrastructure, you've seen a lot of things. If you were to start your career again right now, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, hindsight being what it is, but without, I think one of the things, and this is common in folks my age especially that came from systems admin, network admin background, is I have no development skills. I don't think you need to be able to write software. I think the ability to do some scripting is almost critical if you still have a job where you have to do stuff. I mean, if you're not like me and you're just whatever it is I do, I don't quite understand. I talk to people and I listen to people. And so the language that I work in is the English language. And that's a very powerful programming language. But it doesn't help deploy 10,000 instances out of Docker containers this afternoon. And that's one of the things that a lot of folks that have been in the industry a while have this challenge, and especially as they move into virtualization and cloud, where you need to be able to do some automation. Now, if you came from the Unix side and you did a lot of shell scripting, you can probably leverage that. I always, if my batch files on Windows worked the first time, I was all like, ooh. I think that's a whole. But the path I took, I learned how to diagnose things when getting it wrong meant that I got to go to the hospital again and get parts of my body sewn back on or sewn up. And so, diagnostics where it hurts people was, interesting. It's a little easier to see things that are broken when you're working on cars, but I think the path worked well for me. It took longer than maybe it should have, but I think that, the skill set that I don't have is in software development, although had I done it then, it would be in a language that, nobody's using now. But I think it's more important to be able to understand coding at some level, even if you don't do it anymore. But other than that, I would have liked to have started in this direction sooner. You know, people that are my age, like, Woz and Gates and those folks, they had a little head start, and I think they might have gotten a little farther in technology than I have.
What do you think the biggest lesson you've learned throughout your career?
It goes back to what I've shared. You know, what you learn, share what you learn. You know, engage and be part of community and conversation, because that creates this feedback loop, and it continuously builds.
Excellent. Well, we're now enough for me, so I'd like to throw questions out to the floor. We have people with microphones, so if anyone would like to ask a question for Jack. Yep.
Yes,
please,
ma'am.
They are just running as we speak. Yes, just down the front here, please.
Okay, question number 1, how old is the beard? And question number 2, what are you not telling us about security?
I last shaved in December of 1979. And as someone who attends a lot of technology and hacker conferences, that means I have many friends who are younger than my beard. But there's so much about security that I don't know, and therefore I'm not telling you. But that's a loaded question. How to paraphrase it? To put it really bluntly, here's the bottom line on security: we're screwed, but it's okay.
Will we always be screwed?
Various people have put it in different ways, but the internet is broken, and it's just broken enough to stick together enough to drive the global economy. That's not terribly broken, right? There are a lot of challenges. One of the things that we have, and this is, I've heard about it at big events for years, especially the business side and enterprise focused, is the operationalization of security. And in enterprises, this is a terrible challenge because we build silos wonderfully. And then once we have built our silos, we stratify. It's one of the things that frustrates me. Academia is isolated from industry. Parts of academia feed into government and military or intelligence, but doesn't get to the rest of government. You can't say government and assume that means one entity, right? The education department does not get the same resources as the State Department, so we build these silos, and then we stratify because the technologists don't get it. The executives, the technologists say you have to dumb things down for the executives because they don't understand that simple is not dumb. Simple is extremely hard. Concise is, as an editor, concise is nearly impossible. So we have a real problem communicating. We have all of these silos, and we don't do a good job, breaking them down, and we don't share that. And those conversations don't happen. And so we also have solved a lot of problems many times. One of the things I've been doing the past year and a half, 2 years, has been focusing on the history of InfoSec. I came in later, and so I've forced myself to look back. And people like Spaff, Gene Spafford, has become a friend over the years, and I'm a better person for it. He gives me a historical perspective. He points me in a direction, and I go off and learn a lot. And I've looked at a lot of people that I didn't know that were foundational figures, and I've learned a lot of stories, and I've shared them in presentations. I've started a project I call the Shoulders of InfoSec that is a lot of historical figures that are foundational. And I use the phrase shoulders because Newton is most famously credited with it.
Standing on the shoulders.
But he acknowledged, he leveraged that from someone that wrote to him. And we all, in whatever we do, stand on the shoulders of giants. Here in our industry, there are a lot of unsung people. So I focus on the giants we know, right? Turing, Grace Hopper, they're people that we all know or should know. But you don't have to be a giant to provide a shoulder for someone to stand on. So I focus on a lot of lesser known people, and that's something I've tried to do. And if you'll forgive me for being idealistic for a moment, one of the things I've found about B-Sides is I get way too much credit. I help run the Las Vegas event. I give advice to a lot of people. I'm on the global board. I talk to a lot of people, help them deal with their events, help them deal with challenges that come up. But I run the network at B-Sides Vegas. That's a challenge by itself. 1,600 hackers in a hotel in Vegas. Running the network is a challenge. But Genevieve Southwick, GK, does a phenomenal job. She's the producer. I get way too much credit for B-Sides globally. People were thanking me for B-Sides London. I showed up. I hung out and chatted with people. But what I've found particularly there is that if you try to shine a light on yourself, and there are people in our industry who really do this, they take the spotlight and they aim it on themselves. And, okay. But what I've found through the years, please forgive the sentimentality, is if you have the spotlight and you choose to shine it on others who deserve the light, the reflected glow ends up with you sitting here with you today.
Flattery. Any more questions, please? Well, if no questions? Sorry, question, yes, please.
Do you see we're encountering a greater problem of moving, let's say, protocols on, as we've encountered so many difficulties with SSL and TLS and other major things that we have built this world economy on? Do you see an issue in our ability to move those things on when we realize and discover issues that have been around for
Yes.
10 years that we can't move past? Because we can't.
There are fundamental issues we've known about for a very long time. One of the folks I work with, I mentioned Astaro, worked with some great people there. At Tenable, I work with some fantastic people. I work with Marcus Ranum. For those that know or know of Marcus, there's a two-person team, Marcus Ranum and myself. For those that haven't done the math on this, that makes Marcus the young person in our team and me the idealist, so that's a little scary. One of the other people I work with is Chris Thomas, better known to most of us as Space Rogue, one of the early members of Loft, one of the few people that's ever testified before a U.S. Congress committee under an alias. He was there when Loft said that they could take down the internet in 30 minutes. What they were talking about were BGP fundamental flaws. We've slightly improved BGP in the past 20 years, and only slightly. And those that are familiar with backbone routing know that people still do not shut down prefix advertisements from areas they shouldn't listen to. And it's been a few years since Pakistan took YouTube off the internet by an advertisement. So we're not there. One of the ones that I think is really going to be a challenge, and I've talked about it for years, and I've been very careful not to get into the hype, but it's finally time to start raising the alarm, which is IPv6. I talk to people all of the time who just are ignoring IPv6. In the US, we have plenty of IPv4 addresses. In Western Europe, it's pretty good. If you get to Asia Pacific, outside of Australia, they're long exhausted IPv4. But when you bring in, every Windows operating system for many years, Apple, every modern Linux operating system has IPv6 enabled by default. Windows has the tunnels enabled by default. All of those protocols that we've turned off because we don't need them, they're exposed now directly on the internet, and now we're going to see more of those, and we're going to see the new versions of protocols in IPv6 start to get hammered. And I've talked to people that have, I've convinced them to look for IPv6 in their network, and I actually had one customer who I convinced to take a look at something using one of our tools, but it doesn't matter how you look for IPv6. He actually cut a call short that we were on once he saw how much IPv6 traffic there was in their environment. And it's like, I'm sorry, we have to go pull wires out of a closet. So there are those. The other thing that's happening just in the past couple of weeks, Akamai issued their State of the Internet report and talked about IPv6 systems that are being stood up, denial of service is moving there. So we're going to see both old and new versions of old protocols with old and new bugs for a long time. I mean, you look at where we are with DNS. We've known that DNS exposes us to reflection attacks, DNS hijacking, and DNSSEC was offered, and that's gotten I'm sorry, Mr. Kaminsky, wherever you are, but DNSSEC has gotten nowhere so far.
Fellow inductee.
Yes, but so yeah, we have a lot of things that are out there. And that goes back to what I was saying about the silos. People just, the people that understand some of these problems aren't there. And coming from a small business background, it's kind of funny to talk about operationalizing security, because not only did I run the networks and run security, but for years when it snowed, I drove one of the snow plows, and then I took out the garbage when I left the office. It's operationalized janitorial services, and because that's the way small business works. Now, I didn't have the resources that enterprises do, but we didn't have the silos either.
Any more questions? Yeah, sorry, questions.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
David?
David. Yeah, the question down here, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Jack.
Hey.
Earlier you mentioned you work to solve security problems without impacting the user experience. And who do you think is doing that well now, and how do you think they're doing it?
The cynical answer is nobody's doing it well. I think the people that are at least aware of it are doing it better. One of the things in doing historical stuff that I've focused on is from 1967 to 1970, Willis Ware led a team that produced what in the U.S. is known as the Ware Report. It's now, the final version came out in 1970. One of the takeaway quotes from that was that if user experience has to be considered in the design and implementation of systems, because if security gets in the way, users will bypass or subvert security. And we've had people telling us this for 50 years, and if you want to know how, if you're concerned about privacy as I am, and you want to know how NSA and GCHQ and everybody else reads your email, it's, well, have you tried to get a non-technical person to use PGP? Okay, the usability of stuff is a real challenge. I think that the things that we make seamless or more seamless, one of the challenges we have in the United States is chip and pin credit cards. So we're getting chip and SIG, not chip and pin, so I still can't do automated trains and stuff with my US cards. And people are arguing about the cost versus security trade-off. And my argument has been, it may be too much money, but here's the thing. When my friends come from Europe to the US, their cards don't work right. When I come to Europe or other parts of the world, my card doesn't work right. Let's solve a usability problem and potentially improve security a little bit. When we get those opportunities, we should take them instead of having months-long protracted battles in press and blogs and Twitter about the security value. So if we can advance things, it's if we can do things with smart cards, and if we can make two-factor auth easier. It's like, yes, you can have your iPhone on the corporate network if you install the approved authenticator app and use it for two-factor auth.
Excellent.
So we have a final question at the back here.
Oh, yep. I was saying just one, please.
One final question.
Thanks. What is your advice to technologists, people who work in the trenches, who interact daily with director-level people and managers?
There are a lot of people that tell you how to talk to executives. What I would say is, if you have the opportunity to talk to executives, take the opportunity. But more important than talking to them is listening to them. If you can have any kind of meaningful conversation and hear what they want to talk about, what they're concerned with, what their objectives are, then you will be able to speak to them. I don't know that we need to speak, executive ease to talk to them, but you need to understand as a technologist that your technology, whether it's security or networking or whatever, is a component of driving your organization forward. Even those of us who are security vendors, our networks are there to enable our developers to commit code to our repositories, for our QA teams to test that code, for our marketing people to generate documents, to push that out to the public. Our network is not there to be secure, right? GCHQ has a different mission. NSA, they put more resources into security because it's critical, as do many of us in the security field. But the organization has another goal, and it doesn't mean that as a technologist you need to be worried about every morning stock numbers, but it does mean you need to understand what makes the business drive. And one of the challenges I think we often have is that when we get an audience with the executives, we want to tell them what we want to tell them. And we need to do that, but we want to start a conversation and then listen.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to end the conversation here. I'd like to say thank you very much for coming to see us this morning. But most of all, I'd like to thank Jack. And all that's left for us to present, to officially induct Jack into our Hall of Fame.
Well, thank you very much.
An industry legend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just one final thing about why we're all here is we'd like to pay a short tribute to a fellow security pioneer, Steve Gold, who recently passed away. So, to Steve. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.